Oh, I think that's going. Great. So we're super excited to have Clarence Lacy Jr. here. He graduated from UofT's MLA program in 2013 after having completed a thesis entitled "This Thesis is Not About the Gardiner," which envisioned a cityscape focused around leisure and very few cars. Our very own Francesco Martire, who's here on the call right now, was his thesis advisor. 7 years later, Clarence works as a landscape architectural designer at RIOS, an LA-based multidisciplinary firm focused on creating rich, comprehensive solutions for a variety of design challenges. He will be joining us virtually today, right now. He's on the call. Before I pass the baton over to Clarence, I am going to read out a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, the digital space and conceptual place that we are meeting in, as well as the meeting place of Toronto, are still the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. While we recognize that not everyone is sharing the same space during this time, we encourage each of you to take the time to think about, learn, and reflect upon where you are and the Indigenous peoples who have lived there, are currently there, and the future generations who will live there. As people living on this land, it's essential for us to reflect the ethos and respect that the Indigenous communities show towards the land and towards each other. We must show support through our actions, not just our words, for those of us who are occupying this land. And with that said, I would like to invite Clarence to the stage.
Well, thank you for having me, and I want to thank everyone. I do also want to have a quick acknowledgement of the land here in Los Angeles. Being located in Los Angeles and as a designer and as an agent of change of the built environment and the landscape, we must acknowledge the Tonga people, the traditional caretakers of the land of the LA Basin. This unceded land was stolen, and we must acknowledge and not erase that past as we work towards an environment that is respectful and inclusive of their history. Thank you. And I'll go ahead and get started. I wanted to first kind of frame this as like a quick little presentation of my history and how I got involved into landscape architecture, my time at Daniels, and then some of the things that I've been doing and how my career has kind of shaped since then. So let me share. So I have to kind of start out talking about my initial steps. I was one of those kids that played SimCity for 12, 13 hours a day. When I was not at school, I was playing SimCity. And that kind of developed this, this curiosity about urban form, and about planning, and about development. So I attended Iowa State University and got a degree in planning. That planning degree was really structured around policy and small town development, and not really about sort of large scale landscape. I had a huge interest in design from a couple of studios that I had when I was at Iowa State. And one of those was a campus design project for the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes in Oklahoma. And another one was a plan for a redevelopment of a mall in Story City, which is in northwest Iowa. I'm sure no one's heard of it. So after I completed my studies at Iowa State, I went on and I took a planning internship with the DC Office of Planning. Again, I was like, I'm going to be a planner. That's what I want to do. I'm going to sit there. I'm going to stamp drawings. I'm going to tell people no. So I ended up refocusing myself because I wanted to do something a little bit more design oriented. And I had a professor that mentioned University of Toronto. He was like, oh yeah, you should think about going there. I know you probably have never heard of it, you know, being American, and, you know, they're doing really great things up in Toronto. And he was like, you know, it's basically like going to an Ivy League school. And I was like, well, count me in. So I journeyed up to University of Toronto, and that's kind of how that whole story started. And while I was at University of Toronto, I continued kind of studying how landscape architecture and planning can kind of change the way that we think about the urban form. And that's something that, you know, I continue today as a landscape architect or a landscape designer. So just, oh, sorry, there we go. Just to kind of think about some of the things that I've done while I was at University of Toronto. Sort of my second year was really big. I was involved in 4 competitions. 2 of them were shortlisted. And I would say that if you ever have the chance to do a competition, not only is it great to possibly win something, but it's also just great to test weird ideas, test weird methods of communication, representation, and then also to just, I don't know, just have fun. And there are a couple of competitions that we've started and we never really handed in, we never really finished it, but just having that ability, that kind of outlet to think about things beyond what we normally do in our course work. I also I took an interest into stormwater management and about systems within landscape architecture. I had a little bit of a green infrastructure and stormwater study that I did with UofT that summer. But the biggest part of my second year, well, the second biggest project I would say I did at Daniels would be for the Super Studio. It was really the time that I just blew everything out of the water. I was just like, you know what, I'm just gonna do something super crazy. I'm gonna take the idea of current suburban form and I'm just gonna stack it on top of each other. And I'm just gonna make a tower that is basically a vertical city. And it was really weird. And I knew that it wasn't exactly the traditional landscape architecture project that most people would kind of see or kind of gravitate towards, but I just knew that it was kind of where I wanted to go. You know, I always had an interest in architecture and being like really weird and just kind of thinking about urban form in a different way. And this will appear again. We talked a little bit about my thesis, so it will appear again. But then there were a few other things that kind of were circling in my mind at that time. I was doing a lot of side little music production and some side little projects with reading up in philosophy. And those things also began to inform my work. And one important thing that I learned specifically, I would say in my second and third year, is to develop those curiosities and embed them in all the work that you do. Just because, like, you know, you're thinking, oh, well, music production, that has nothing to do with landscape architecture, but you kind of, it becomes a way to exercise your creativity. It's something that can tie into a project. Maybe it's a way of presenting something to a client or presenting a project. And in that third year, I actually worked on a film project where I used one of the tracks that I made in order to score it. So it wasn't something that it was kind of a throwaway, just some pet project. It was actually something that, you know, had some sort of real return from it. So in addition to that, I worked with Rob that summer on some stormwater management projects, working on a few projects that were out near Pearson Airport and also in other parts of West Toronto. And those projects really helped me start to hone some of those technical skills, some of those detailing skills, thinking about paving systems and about landscape systems, about treatment, filtration, and reuse. And that really, you know, as rudimentary as the studies were at that point, I still kind of refer to a lot of that information in my actual professional practice. As I said, there were these ideas of philosophy floating in my head as I started going into my third year, which was all about kind of the thesis prep and what is the thesis going to be. And it was kind of this daunting project, like what am I going to do? What do I want to study? And living in Toronto, I lived mostly in the Cabbagetown area, so I had a lot of access to the Gardiner. I played flag football over in the fields at the beaches. So I had a huge kind of connection every day to going underneath the Gardiner, traveling across the Gardiner. So it was always in my mind. It was actually pretty prominent in the news at that time. Some of the conversations about the future of the Gardiner, that came back up again. So I thought, what better thing could I do? But, you know, combine my curiosities about stacking urbanism and this crumbling piece of infrastructure. So the approach that I took to my thesis, which it became a little bit of a roundabout project, was to not just look at this as a design project, but just kind of as a critique of a piece of urbanism, a critique of the way that we've developed and the way that we use infrastructure. I wanted to think about the Gardiner as not just this crumbling piece of infrastructure that needs to be taken down and repurposed, but it has this idea of artifact. It's something that, you know, traveling through the city, you see it and it's a landmark. It's something that kind of tells you that you've arrived. But how can we, you know, remove the singular use of the single occupant vehicle and make it something that's a little bit more of a piece of urbanism and something that's a little bit more authentic, something that's not so regimented. So going completely against my original education and planning, it's kind of like, how do we break from planning and make something that's authentic and urbanism that's solely about people and about people interacting, people, you know, voyeurism, about recreation, about leisure. Like, these things aren't regulated to a, you know, four walls and a roof type of house. It becomes like this new type of form of urbanism. An approach that I took to the Gardiner was this notion of détournement. So I was looking at how can we begin to affix things to urbanism to make it something that works more for the people, something that does not feel segregated by uses, by socioeconomic status, but something that feels totally inclusive. So in that, you know, I didn't fully let go of all of my prior knowledge, but it was looking at, okay, so we have these systems that exist with transit, with bicycles, with pedestrianism, and how do we bring all of those things together? Where along the Gardiner are the key moments and the opportunity zones for us to kind of go in there and have some sort of major impact? So this project had a lot of mapping and mapping kind of in a planimetric sense, also in a sectional sense, and then also just kind of in this imaginative kind of fourth plane kind of sense, where it's how do you create these kind of collages and, again, kind of they turn the urban fabric to be something that's new and a little bit more exciting. So what I kind of came up with is this combination of structures that would hold up the existing Gardiner, become this new transportation armature in the city, but then ensure that we are keeping those pieces, the piers, which are the relics. And that notion of relic and landmark are things, again, that kind of come up again and again as a professional. So the thing that kind of linked me between school and then my professional life was the annual, and Jasmine and I worked on the annual together, and it was a great experience. It was a lot of work, a lot more work than we thought it was going to be, but it was quite a successful launch, and then it was also a great way to kind of look at everyone else's work. And I would say one of the things that I learned, and I know it's really hard to do that digitally now, but one of the things that I would say is, like, I've learned so much from looking at other people's work, whether it's graphic styles or like new ideas or just kind of, you know, just having fun. It's just like you get so much, not just of someone's personality, but kind of the way that they think by just looking at their work, even if they don't present it to you, and then going through and trying to curate it and trying to find the meaning and not just look at the pretty pictures. So one other thing that bridged between my academic and professional life was one more competition. It was like my last one. It was one of those things that I started it before I had a job, and then when I had a job, it was very difficult to kind of continue with it. So I'm glad that I spent a lot of time while I was at Daniels going through and doing competitions and just trying new things, because I knew that professional life, you know, even though you spend less hours at the office than you do in the studio, it just feels a lot more taxing. You feel a lot more drained because you're not as invigorated with your creativity. So just like getting it all out was definitely something that helped. So my first job was with Studio TLA, which is previously known as Terraplan. And I was getting into my first job, and I thought that every project that I touched, it needed to be gold. And just kind of learning the processes and learning that, you start out with a general idea that has to go through a site plan approval, and then you revisit that idea, and then you take that to the client, and then the client says this, and you have to revisit it over and over and over again. There were a number of projects that I worked mainly on the site plan approval. So I was like coming up with some really cool ideas that might not necessarily be the most cost effective or the easily constructed option for that site. But, I was just trying to get a lot of ideas out to kind of be like, oh yeah, wouldn't it be really cool if we did this on top of a condo building? But just kind of learning like the actual processes of development was great for that time period. And I started to get some more of that technical knowledge, again, borrowing what I learned from working with CLRs, just like, how do you actually start to detail those things? How do you actually start to construct permeable paver systems or swales? And then one project I wanted to talk about in particular is this one. We had the idea of going in and renovating this drop-off area for Marina Del Rey condos. And we had this great idea of having this massive kind of shade structure, and it would twist into 3 directions. And we came up with this, we budgeted it, we made it come into the budget that the client wanted. And I left Terraplan, I thought it would get built. And what ended up happening was they kept the paving. They didn't do any of the retaining walls. They did some of the planting, but then the point of the whole thing, which was this shade structure, was taken away. So that was one of the things that I learned. It's just like, you can't get too attached to it. So if you have a project and you touch everything in that project, just make sure that everything in that project is great. That way, if one thing gets removed, the rest of the project can still stand. So many things, not just from this Terraplan, but throughout my life up until now, just like kind of learn that it's just, you have to bring everything up to a great level, because you can't just depend on one object, which is not something that I did in school. So after I left Toronto, I went to the Bay Area, and I got a job at Royston, Hanamoto, Alley and Abbey. And it's sort of an old name type firm, very classic art, landscape architecture. And that's where I got to get back into my crazy phase. Working on some of these really hypothetical guerrilla urbanism projects with the Union Square Business Improvement District was just like, they were asking for quick ideas and like, what can we do to kind of make this fun? It might be something that gets installed, it might not, it might be something that lasts for a couple of months. And so just kind of thinking about how to get these objects, how to install them, how long they'll last, and how to pay for them. And it was just like a really great and like a really fun time to kind of like have that. And on the other side of that was a little bit more of this highly technical work. 2 great things that came out of that were a bus shelter that actually was built, I want to say 3 years ago in Mill Valley. And this plaza in Napa, which has this bench that I designed the details for. And basically this was my first project where I was given full control of all of the design. And that was 2015. So about 2 years after I graduated. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. I finally made it. So then I left RHA and I moved down to LA, and it kind of hit me again. It's just like, okay, well, that was really fun. It was a very small firm, and I had the ability to do some of those projects where it was like, here, take the entire design control. But getting down to Abe in LA, I quickly learned the only reason why I had that opportunity is because it was a small firm. But on the flip side of that, being at a slightly larger firm, I had the opportunity to work on a breadth of public projects, which is something that I really wanted to do. Getting into landscape architecture was how do you affect the urban environment, not just from a development standpoint? How do you start to look at streetscapes? How do you look at transit? How do you look at roadway corridors? How do you begin to design all of those pieces? While I was at Abe, I did 3 pretty big transportation projects, 2 streetscape projects, and a master plan for a couple of parks. And being at Abe, I had to kind of start from square one. That was one thing that I learned from hopping around. It's not always a line of exponential or linear growth. You kind of have those stair steps where you kind of drop back a little bit because you have to be tested. But one good thing about kind of hopping around to these different firms in these different regions is you start to learn the construction practices that are different. You start to learn like the aesthetic choices that are different. You start to learn sort of the cultural differences. You start to learn the governmental processes that are all different. And like having that knowledge is actually quite great because you can kind of find solutions that, everyone in LA is not going to find the same solution that I may have found in Toronto. So just having that knowledge and having that experience of being in different regions, I would say really helped me. But while I was at Abe is when my career kind of took another pivot, and that's where I started managing projects. So I still had a couple, like the Memorial Park Master Plan, where I was kind of given that as, here, come up with some design options, present it, and kind of be in control of the design. But then there were projects like Gold Line, where I was given a little bit of that freedom in the beginning, but then it was quickly changed to, well, I need you to manage this effort. You need to manage the team of 5 people in order to get this out the door. Which is great because you kind of have the stamp on the entire project, but you don't have the same creative freedom. You don't have the same fingerprint that everyone has. But there is something really rewarding about managing a project, and that is when it's built, you kind of see it a little bit differently. A lot of times in the professional realm, when you are strictly on the design side, it's more about the pretty picture or like, resolving detail little conflicts or picking up red lines. But when you're managing it, it's a little bit more of a kind of a broad stroke of design. Probably not explaining that to the highest level, but I think I'll touch on it a little bit later. So I was at Abe for about 2 years, and then I have a friend at RIOS, which is currently where I work, that asked me to come in for an interview. And this was the first time that I'd never went out to seek for a job, but it became something through networking, which is also something that's you don't really get by hopping around to different cities. So I'm learning, there are advantages, but then there's also disadvantages. So in 2018, I joined RIOS, and joining RIOS was a great thing for me because although it was a little bit of a step back or a couple of steps back sort of in my professional trajectory, it gave me exposure to something that was very high design. Everything that RIOS does is about embedding a narrative, which is something that we do a lot in studio projects. Is we try to find what is the story of the site, what is the story that we're trying to convey with what we're designing, and how do we convey that not just to the client but to the end user. So I'm slowly getting into this narrative base in everything that I do, and ensuring that nothing is just like, well, just get it done. That get it done is kind of out the door for me now. And it's just like, how do you embed that narrative? So I've been given the opportunity to manage a couple of pretty large projects. One is a pretty large mixed use building in the Arts District in LA. That one is a little bit of an adaptive reuse and then a little bit of revelatory landscape architecture, bringing the story of the site into the overall design. Another project, which I'm actually pretty proud of, is this Martin Expo project. It was one that I came in after the initial concept was there, but it's being constructed right now, which is pretty great to see. But then the other half of being at RIOS has been their priority for the curiosities and their priority for studio culture. And this is kind of getting back to those ideas that we have a lot when we're in school. It's just like, how can I be inspired by something that's not necessarily typical landscape architecture? So we have a research program where we can pick any type of topic and they give you a prompt. So the prompt last year was So how do you rethink something? How do you reimagine it? How do you rebuild? So we decided to study street trees and think about street trees as not just something that you put on the street, but as individuals, and focusing on mature trees and established trees. The city of Los Angeles has a history of planting pretty large ficus trees inside of pretty narrow spaces. So the policy right now is to cut all of them down and not to really think about it in a different way. Is to cut it down and then put a brand new kind of sapling tree in its place. The way we wanted to think about these trees as individuals is, these trees have been there for 40, 50 years. They are part of the neighborhood. They're, that's someone's neighbor. There are benefits that tree gives to that neighborhood that go beyond cooling and stormwater management. That becomes sort of a landmark. It becomes a safe place for the kids to play. So we were thinking, okay, what is the I don't want to say illegal, what is the non-legal way that we can kind of jog a sidewalk around a tree? And we're given time to investigate that. And we came up with a couple of options and like a whole new kind of public process of how do you begin to tackle a broken sidewalk around a ficus tree. And then the other big thing that I've been working on at RIOS, and this is the thing that kind of takes up the most of my time, is thinking about a social impact initiative. And with that initiative, it goes beyond sort of a diversity statement. It goes beyond looking at the typical corporate social responsibility. It looks at how a diversity initiative can be something that comes from the actual staff and from the actual workers. It doesn't come from the top down. And how is it something that everybody is involved in? It's not just something that's judged by numbers, but judged by participation and by action, by results. It is both sort of internal and external initiatives, looking at both our office culture and our practices, our business practices, but then also looking at how we interface with clients. How do we talk about our projects? How do we come up with ideas, and what are the stories that we tell? If there is a site that is in a very controversial situation, like how do we approach that? Do we take those projects? And then how do we become a better neighbor? How do we become stewards in our community? How do we participate in internship and mentorship programs? So this is something that me and 8 other people have been leading in our office. Our office is about 160, to kind of give you a little bit of context. So that kind of brings us up to the current point. And I want to wrap it up by just kind of giving like a couple of highlights and just kind of give a little bit of perspective about, the last 6 years and like how I've gotten, or I guess 7 years, sorry. And, how long it actually took me to get to the steps that, the place that I am. And, graduating in 2013, I got my first job in November, I believe it was. So it was probably about 4 months until I actually got a job. It took me until my second job to actually get a project where I was actually given control over the design. The first steps in my career were all about, can you pick this red line up? Can you make these sections? Can you do this perspective? Can you do this model? And that's totally typical. And it's not, it took me a little while doing that to understand that that is the typical way. And I need to kind of just like go through these motions. I need to learn how to work in an office, how to work for other people, how to work on real world projects before I could actually have that design control. And then it took another year after that for me to actually manage a project. And that was actually a really small one. It was basically the landscape around two sides of a building. So it was just planting and a couple of trees. And then it took another year after that for me to, as I said, with the Gold Line project, to actually manage a project that was a team. That previous project was just me. It was just me and the principal that we worked together, but I was there to work with the architect and the engineer and everything to make sure everything's coordinated. And then it took until 2019 for me to have a pretty major project, which is the mixed use building in the Arts District, which is it's a 40-story tower and then another small office building. So, after 6 years, it's kind of, that's how long it took me. Some people it's going to take longer, some people it's a little bit quicker, but that's just kind of the way that I got there. And some takeaways that I would say is, again, kind of remain curious and think about all of those things that interest you and try to embed that in your work. Not saying that, just because you like music, that every single park that you do has to have a musical element. It's just more about, thinking about those processes that you have within your hobbies and like bring that to your design process. Don't be afraid to try new places and new things and new jobs. Especially at first when you're trying to gain your footing. I'm glad that I floated around a little bit. And then again, regionally, surprisingly, it translated very well from Toronto to working in the Bay. I think a lot of it had to do more with University of Toronto than it did with working for TerraPlan, but it was a big kind of shock from going and working for a year and a half in Toronto and getting an education in Toronto where there's snow and there's freeze thaw, and then coming to California where that doesn't exist anymore. So it gives me a little bit of a leg up on people in the firm when we're working in snowier regions or colder regions, but it's definitely something that I don't revisit very often. And then also to look at everything as an opportunity. Some of the shortcomings that I've had, or what I would probably have seen as failures, I look back at them now as opportunities and not just mistakes. As long as you're learning from something, I would never say that it's bad, and it's just it's a way to make the next project better. It's the way to make the next interaction better. Research is very important, not just when it comes to looking for a job, not just when it comes to doing a project, but just kind of like in your own kind of curiosities. One thing that I wish that I did not do, it's a weird way to say that, but I wish that I kept reading between when I graduated and now. I took a hiatus of about 3 years or 3 or 4 years of just not reading anything more about landscape architecture or philosophy or anything. I was pretty content and complacent with where I was. And I would say that's not the way to go. Just kind of like keep doing that research. And again, kind of going back to the first point of keep remaining curious. You can always get better. I think back to my thesis presentation, and I know that I did not explain any of that well. I can go back and probably write an amazing paper about it now, but at the time, I just was like I was very focused on, I need to get this done. I need to get a project out the door. At first, it was becoming a research paper and like this, what am I trying to say? This piece of philosophy, but I had to rein it back in to do a design project. And I know that I didn't present it the right way. And, I kick myself about it now, but again, it's an opportunity for me now to kind of reflect on it and talk about it a bit differently. Competitions are definitely something that I wish I had more time to do now. I've worked on a couple sort of as business pursuits in my professional life, but I just don't have the time to do those leisure competitions now. So doing all of that while I was at Daniels and kind of in my first year of working, I would say that's like the way to do it. And I wish that I did more. And then the last point I would say is kind of one thing that I learned is you don't have to stay in a job that doesn't work for you. One thing that I really learned at Terraplan was it was my time to go. Like I got that, that foot in the door of landscape architecture, learning the real world, but the trajectory was not going in the direction that I wanted. I wanted to do a little bit more of public projects. I wanted to do something a little bit more kind of temporary. I wanted to do something that wasn't really that market sector. So I stayed as long as I thought that I should. I got as much out of that job, and then I moved on. Like when you're at a job, you do your best and you do everything for them, but they should also be doing something for you. And that's not knocking on them. It's like on every job that I've had so far. So I'm hoping that that's a little bit encouraging and kind of see a little bit of what my story is, and how I navigated my way through Daniels, through early professionalism, and then I guess I'm kind of getting close to the mid-career point, being kind of 7 years. So I'm getting close to that 10 years. So again, I'm hoping that was helpful, and I'll open it up for questions, I guess. I don't know if it's next, so.
Yeah. So, I mean, I should have probably said this at the start. Thank you so much, Clarence. That was great. I'm hoping I'm allowed to quote you because I have madly scribbled notes on a document on the side here. Particularly, I think what was it? I mean, everything you said was great, but I really like the one where you mentioned make sure everything is great in your project, because if something gets removed, you want everything else to be great. I feel like in studio right now, it's like with time constraints and things, it's like you pick the one, feature you want to maintain or whatever. I also really liked your timeline. I think that was a really great, effective way of presenting the information, and we might request that that's the format in the future. And then I just have one comment. I know people probably have a lot of questions, but about the trees that you mentioned, a friend of mine in Thesis right now is looking at kind of rewilding and returning Southern Ontario to the Carolinian forest. And we were just having a discussion like an hour ago about how different the world or a city would look if you designed around trees. So it really resonated. We're going to go through a couple kind of questions that we have, and then we're going to open it up for in about 5 or so minutes to audience questions. So if you guys have questions, have them prepared. At that point, you can either turn your mic off and ask it yourself, or you can pop it in the chat and I'm happy to read it out. One question that kind of came up for us was, we were wondering whether you faced any challenges in transitioning from the academic world into the private sector. Are there aspects of academia that you miss now that you're in the private sector? And is there anything that you prefer between the two? We're just kind of considering all the students that are, facing career choices, imminent career choices. If you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I guess the first part of that, it was difficult to transition from academia to professional life, just because, again, the way that I left my thesis was very kind of open-ended, and saying this is not about the Gardiner was like making it a project that doesn't have a site. It's very theoretical, but then like using the Gardiner as a test case, and you can never walk into a client meeting and say, hey, yeah, we're going to look at this not as a site, but then sure, we'll kind of like apply it to your site. It was very difficult that way. And then just kind of thinking about the design process, this kind of loops with the second question is, I feel like the design process, in academia, it's a longer design process. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but what I've noticed in professional life is you'll have that, 3 weeks to come up with the design, and you get the concept, you get the client to buy in, and then that's what it is. Like, there's no revisiting it. And I was notorious for redesigning things, after a couple of weeks, and then get pretty close to like, okay, this is the idea, and then going back and changing it again. I can see Francesco smiling. So that's something that I miss. I miss that freedom. I also miss like being able to have very wild points of inspiration and very wild parties when it comes to design. Now that I'm at RIOS, we get a little bit of that. Like, I've worked on a part of the Martin Expo project where the inspiration was a duck, and it was fine. Like, everybody's like, oh yeah, it's fine, it's a duck. But I will say at other jobs, other projects I've worked on, that would never go well. So I would say just really it's that freedom and the time limits that I miss from academic life.
Okay, so I've got to make the most of it in the next 4 months then. Although I don't necessarily know that I'm graduating into a job, so we'll see. One question was about, so you've worked at a few different firms, and so we were wondering how you built your network, and were you on job sites? Were you talking to people? How were you able to network in that way?
Yeah, I will say that to get my first job, it was a lot easier than the other ones, just because the Toronto network is pretty close knit. Like, even if you don't know the appropriate person to talk to, someone that knows someone. I found my job at TerraPlan through a friend that actually got hired there first. So that's kind of how I got that job. And then coming to California, that network kind of started. So I jumped right into the job in the Bay, was just through looking at the ASLA job link. I found the job, I moved down to LA, and then that's kind of where the whole kind of networking thing started. I met someone that works at RIOS now. I met him when I was working at Abe, and that's how I got the job at RIOS. But then someone that I worked with at the Bay was moving down to LA and was like, hey, I'm looking for a job. And I was just like, oh, well, there you go. So it's, moving around has helped me develop that network within California. But I will say it's mainly been through either like friends, coworkers, ASLA events, or I guess, I don't know if CSLA has the same type of events, but those are great for just kind of meeting people, meeting other new young professionals, meeting people that are new to the area. I think it really kind of depends on what your interests are within the professional sector. Like, are you looking for a public sector job? Are you looking in the private sector? Are you looking for something that's a little bit more research or academic focused? That would kind of judge how your network would work. But I would say for me, it just kind of worked through that, just ASLA and then just former coworkers.
Cool, good to know. We do have an audience question, so I know given time, I just wanted to open it up. Fadi is here, who is a prof at UofT, and he's going to ask you a question.
Hey, Clarence, it's so awesome to meet you. I just have a very quick question that piggybacks on what you just mentioned. I mean, in the last 7 years or so, you've moved around quite a lot in a way, from one geography to the other. And my question is less about the kind of, let's say, work specific experience that you got, but the kind of how, landscape architecture is in so many ways hyper specific and contextual to the environment that you're working in, and not just from the physical attributes, whether it be like the vegetation or the soil or the climate, but just the kind of politics and the sort of like underlying background material that you really have to grapple with to make a project really kind of to kind of make a project that seems to be sort of connected to its context in an appropriate way, if you will. And I'm wondering how you think your education or your sort of landscape background helped you navigate traversing geographies and cultures and things so quickly, because I think oftentimes too students kind of mistake the kind of disciplinary let's say the disciplinary tools that you're given in school from a professional point of view, but also the types of ways that you're trained to kind of think and tackle problems that I think are not even geography bound. So I'm just wondering, how did you kind of, this kind of like super mixed, incredible, rich experience, diverse experience that you've had in the last 7 years, and how do you think that your training helped you with it?
Yeah.
That makes sense.
That's a great question. So I would say from the pragmatic side of it, just like thinking about like approvals and that kind of part of the profession, having a planning background and working in a planning office was actually very beneficial. And having, actually read part of my planning land use law book, I think that kind of gave me a great foundation to be able to go from place to place. Because although every place is different, there's like sort of an underlying kind of basis that's the same all around. And then landscape wise, I would say one great thing about being at Daniels is the opportunity to work in various places. So, we have the studio down in Louisiana, and then we had the ability within our thesis, although I worked in Toronto for that, to kind of work anywhere in the world. And then I had a studio down in Savannah, and actually going there and listening to the people, I was going to say listening to the ground, but it's listening to the ground and really observing. I would say learning that skill of observation at Daniels has really been beneficial, not just because of different regions, but then also because LA is so large and it's so diverse when it comes to topography and soils and vegetation and all of that, and even cultures and politics. It's having those observational skills and being able to kind of do those, that site analysis that, we have in all of our projects to do up front. Like, even though that's not something that you'll necessarily do on every project, just like doing that quick site analysis when you're on site, or making your notes, making your observations, that's been really helpful in terms of like the toolkit that I got.
Thank you. I can't agree with you more.
Well, I know Francesco also had a question, but Liat, you had your hand up, so let's go to you.
That's okay. Francesco, you go first.
Thank you, Liat. Thank you, Clarence. That was a great talk and a wonderful walk down memory lane. I think that in particular, outside of your thesis work specifically, which I obviously remember quite fondly, I'm really glad that you talked about your Super Studio project. I think that was, if I'm not mistaken, that was the inaugural version of the Super Studio that Liat and I taught, and it was perhaps a bit bumpy, but that project has stuck with me over the years. I have to admit, it was just so wonderful. It was just so amazing. So thanks again for the walk down memory lane from that standpoint. My question goes to really those kind of first couple of years, maybe out of school, and I'm first of all, I'm really glad that you kind of talked about the this kind of this path to path through practice, if you will. But I think those first 2 years or 3 years out of school where, perhaps you're not in control of the project, you're coming off of, redesigning the Gardiner, and all of a sudden, having to fit into a kind of system and trying to learn how to, as you mentioned, learn how to work in an office and so on and so forth. can you perhaps maybe talk a little bit more about that, those first couple of years where, you know, it is obviously a transition, but I also think from, at least from my vantage point, that even in that transition, it's a kind of extension of school in a way. You're still really in that kind of learning mode about, you know, understanding how to detail, how to run a project, and you're learning from those, you know, from others that perhaps are a bit more senior in the office. And I wonder if you could speak a bit more about that.
Yeah. I would say the biggest thing is, you know, especially like getting off, you know, finishing a thesis, you have a pretty large ego. You have to kind of get rid of that when you step into an office the first time. And you have to realize that, yes, you might have great design ideas and you might be able to, you know, analyze a site and you might be able to observe a site, but you really have to walk in there as like, I don't know anything and I want to take everything in. I will say it was really bumpy the first year out of school for me because I had a hard time kind of saying like, I know nothing. I was just like, oh, well, I know this already. And I would, yeah, you have to kind of destroy that kind of ego that you build up and kind of take everything in. And like, just because people have been working the profession doesn't mean that they know what they're doing and that they're doing it properly. But, you know, a lot of what we do now, and I was actually having a conversation with somebody about this now, and it's just like a lot of what we do every day might not necessarily be the most correct way, but it is the most efficient way, is the way to get things done. It's the way that the system's set up. So you really have to learn the way that the professional world works, sort of like your first year in Daniels, which I don't know what the first year studio is now, but my first year studio was looking at the back campus and looking at, you know, a hypothetical artist park. And, you know, we were all just kind of like, I don't know what to do. And like, you know, sure, I know what a tree is, but like, what actually is a tree? And like, what is a landscape? You know, we all kind of came in with these ideas of what it could be. And I would say that kind of thirst for knowledge and that kind of like eye open and like greenness and all of that, that's the way you should approach your first job. And I did not do that. It took me a little while to kind of take that step back and start to learn it and start to take it all in. And I'm glad that I did that because I've gained such a large amount of technical skill. And, you know, it's part of the reason why I've been put in charge of managing projects, is just having that that technical skill and that detailing knowledge that I gained from just kind of taking a step back and saying like, okay, well, I don't know everything. I don't need to design everything. I'm okay with like doing, you know, picking up the revisions that somebody else is like placed in front of me on my desk. I'm going to actually look through the set and look at everything. I'm not just going to focus on making the pretty renderings and like the concept presentation. It's just like, just really dig in and just like soak up as much as you can. I would say that would be the advice, because I did not do that until like a little bit later on, maybe like year 2. The answer is yeah.
You know, I was going to mention the exact same thing about Super Studio. I mean, you were that first set of guinea pigs for that studio, which actually, you know, with enough time away from it, I have really fond memories of that experience. But I do absolutely remember your project and the also your MVRDV case study, right? That was the kind of the reference there. Mm-hmm. And that Francesco and I were fortunate enough to have your class the semester before with the Leaside project. So that was another thing. So thank you for these great memories. I wanted to ask you, I was really impressed with what you said about the culture at RIOS and the kind of 2 things that you mentioned there. and I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit more on that. One was on the kind of space to research and how that is structured as part of, you know, billable hours and projects, and how does the firm actually structure that in, or not only structure it in, but structure, like prioritize or choose, select what, or you know, who do they give the option to select what the topic would be? And then the other was that you mentioned about the social impact initiative, and how again the firm either gave you that space to do so, or what was that something that the staff pushed for, or how did that sort of evolve, and how, you know, what do you take away from it so far?
Yeah, the culture at RIOS is great, because again, they want everyone to be curious, and they want everyone to have some sort of stake in the company. And one thing that they do, again, is this research program. And every year, they didn't do it this year, obviously, because of COVID, but every year, a couple of the creative directors, who are the principals, and then a few of the studio directors, which kind of had the different architecture and landscape studios within our office, they will get together and they'll come up with a prompt every year. And it might be, I think one year it was adapt, and then our year it was re. And they put out the prompt and they say, hey, anyone that has a proposal, just do a quick little write-up and we'll review it. And there's an application process. You fill it out, they review the application, and they have a set number that they award every year. They have two different research grants. One is for a full year, and then the other, I think, is for 6 months, either 6 or 8 months. And the money that's or inside of your application, you say, this is the number of hours that I'll need over the course of the 6 months or over the course of the year. And they review the application and they'll say, yes, everything looks great. Or they'll say, this is a great topic, but can we reduce your hours? You might need to increase your hours. And all of that is built into your schedule for the week. So every week we have a schedule that says you will work X number of hours on this project and this project. So they actually give us a line for every week that would say, okay, 2 hours is what you get. And then as the phases progress, because we have to put together an entire work plan that says, okay, this is the number of hours that we'll get or that we need for the project. Each person would get this number of hours at this type of phase. So if we wanted to do sort of like with the street tree project, there was a data collection phase, a research phase, and a prototyping phase. And I said, well, I'm not as interested in the prototyping as I am in the research and data collection. So my hours were kind of, weighted towards those two, while other people's were weighted towards the other. So it's all kind of filled into your schedule that way. And at the end of the research period, and actually periodically, you have reviews with the research committee, which might be 2 of the studio directors and like maybe another project manager that are interested in the topic, and they'll kind of sit and say, what's your progress? And they'll make sure that we're on track. So there is a sort of a pot of money that's set aside every single year that's specifically for research. And this year, because we don't have research projects because of COVID, that money was allotted to the social impact initiative to use. So we were able to use that research money to pay for our hours on working on all of the infrastructure and developing some initial programs for the social impact initiative. So the story with that initiative is, it actually started with a few of us that just had ideas about what are the activities the office should be doing in order to make it more inclusive and make it more diverse. And it wasn't really anything that was sanctioned at first. We were just kind of meeting on our own time, all volunteer hours. We developed a series of documents and then started giving presentations in the office. And then we met with a couple of the creative directors who are the principals of the firm. And, we kind of stated, this is kind of what we're seeing, this is what we think, a path forward would be. And we actually got 2 of them to be advisors for us. And the rest of the creative directors said, oh, this is great. This fits in with our culture. We want, things to be initiatives coming from the staff and not necessarily handed down from above. So it kind of started out with us just kind of going rogue and just doing what we thought. And some of the language was a little bit stronger at the beginning and very accusatory, but we kind of, made it a little bit more of a, these are things that we're recognizing. We know that we have a different lived experience just because of, how, our demographic, and then also just not being, working in the firm that long and having a different stake in the firm. So we met with them, we said, this is how we think that this should go. And they said, this looks great. So then we got a line item in the budget for social impact initiative. And we actually had a presentation about a month ago that Mark RIOS, one of the partners, gave to the ASLA San Diego chapter about the initiative. So it started, again, it's gotten to the point where it is like the sanctioned thing that everyone's just like, yes, and we've got money for it. But at first it was definitely a volunteer kind of grassroots effort. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much, Clarence. I realized that I haven't even seen the time go by. It's just to be mindful of time. Unless someone has a burning question, we want to be mindful of Clarence's time as well. I think we will wrap this up, but I have probably like 17 questions in my head. So maybe you'll get a follow-up email or something. But thank you everyone for joining us tonight. It was, to our What's Next committee standards, a great turnout. Clarence, thank you so much for joining us. It was nice to have a sunny room to look at during your presentation. And yeah, hopefully we can keep in touch, in the years to come. Everyone else, there is a survey, a link to a survey that we posted in the chat. We'd love to hear from you, given that this is the first year that we're doing this series. If you have names of alumni that you would like to contribute as well, we are all ears. Jasmine, Clarence, if you guys have friends that you want to come, send our way, that works too.
Hopefully next time you can come back in person and hang out in the city with us.
I will be, hopefully I'll be back in Toronto next summer. So
yes.
Hopefully COVID acts right.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you. It was nice to see everyone.
Thank you, Clarence.
Thank you, Clarence.
Thanks, Clarence.
Thank you.
Jules, the YouTube.